Guys, I am thrilled to be joined by Adam Johnson today. If you don't already know, he's the co-host of a podcast that I think should be the most popular podcast in America. I'm not joking. I'm not blowing smoke. I think that Citations Needed is the best media analysis work that you can find in media, bar none. I'm sorry. I learned so much from it. And I am so grateful to it for helping all of us to understand all of the narrative wrangling and magic that's going around, convincing the broader public that things perhaps aren't quite as bad as they seem to us. Thank you so much for joining me here on Bad Faith today, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
As part of your work, you also write articles. You've got two great ones out right now this month. In The Nation, you wrote a piece called "We Live in an Age of Cry Bullyism," where you talk about the kind of hypocrisy and the kind of like weirdly claimed victimhood of figures like Bill Ackman, who, of course, has been leading the charge against any pro-Palestinian advocacy at Harvard University. And also this piece at the Intercept called "Coverage of Gaza War" in the New York Times and other major newspapers heavily favored Israel analysis shows. You co-wrote that piece. I think we should start there and perhaps give people an introduction into the kind of media analysis that you do so well. What did you discover? And can you kind of give some background as to the nature and the technique behind the investigation you did there?
Well, so a researcher who was I guess a fan of the Substack and the show reached out to me. He's a little bit younger than I am. He's a Palestinian American. He has a sort of normal 9 to 5 job, so he remained anonymous for both articles we co-wrote for, I think, fairly obvious reasons. But he's an Oxford trained data researcher, and he does that for a living. And he sort of, I think, wanted to started his own Substack, and he wanted to sort of contribute to the broader, to like more what he viewed as more rigorous media analysis on the issue of pro-Israel or more, I think, more accurately anti-Palestinian bias. And so he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have this stuff I'm working on. It looked really good." So we partnered up. We did a piece for my Substack that we co-published with his initially that looked at specifically CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, looking at their biases. And then we did a follow-up piece that was for the Intercept that was a little bit more difficult to do because of the nature of how print media is. Forgive me. Looking at the anti-Palestinian bias within the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post as a kind of sample, sort of geographic diversity, and also, of course, these are kind of the elite newspapers. And we really looked at sort of 3 or 4 key things. I think the first thing we looked at was just overall mentions of Palestinian Israelis as kind of like a baseline to start. So as Palestinian deaths increased, the mentions remained roughly the same, if not ticked down a little bit in terms of sort of raw mentions. And then I think the most interesting finding was the asymmetry of what we called a motive language or charged language with respect to death. So, for example, we found that the killing of Israelis was, and this is just an analysis of the LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post. For the killing of Israelis, the word slaughter was used 60 times versus once for Palestinians. The word horrific was used a total of 38 times versus 4, and the word massacre was used to describe the killing of Israelis 120 times versus only 4 for Palestinians. As sort of one example, which other analysis had found. One looked at the BBC that other researchers had done that came out around the same time that found similar patterns in their coverage. And in fact, a Canadian publication called The Breach did an analysis of the CBC, the Canadian broadcasting station there that's kind of government funded, similar to the BBC. And they did something interesting. They actually asked the CBC why they only use the word slaughter or horrific in this kind of emotive language with respect to the death of Israelis and not Palestinians, where they use these kind of clinical terms, bombardment, have died, more passive voice. And the answer they gave was a kind of a very to put it generously, a very unsatisfying kind of tautology that basically said, well, it's different. Well, why is it different? Because it's bombing versus shooting them up close. Well, setting aside the fact that that's not true, actually, Israel kills a lot of people up close and personal with respect to sniper fire. And obviously they shoot a lot of people in the West Bank and things of that nature. But even setting that aside, the idea being is that if I lob a 2,000-pound missile into an apartment complex and kill 20 children and 40 people total, that is somehow not a massacre, somehow not horrific, versus if I shoot someone up close was basically their argument, and it was an argument from it was a circular argument. It was basically saying it's different. Well, because it's different. Well, why is it different? Substantively, why is it different? And of course, the answer is it's just a feature of bias that Palestinians are just not seen as being sufficiently human, and therefore the horror and the kind of loaded language ascribed to their deaths is viewed as is put in anodyne or kind of medical terms. And then the third finding we had, which I thought was noteworthy, was the fact that this war, and we only looked at the first 6 weeks, so it's actually probably much worse than we said because we had to limit the scope by otherwise the data set would have become too unwieldy. This was just right before the so-called humanitarian truce in late November. And we found that there was hardly any mention of the fact that this was an unprecedented war on journalists and a war on children. So these are two kind of impacted groups that are oftentimes the focus of state coverage of the war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine to kind of solicit emotion and pity and sympathy from liberals, and I think for good reason. And this was almost non-existent in the coverage of Palestinians. So at the time, 48 journalists had been killed by Israeli forces. The majority of them Palestinian, a handful, I think, were 2 were Israeli, and I think a handful were Lebanese. But overwhelmingly, Palestinian journalists had been killed, and most press watchdogs that have intervened in this discussion have made it clear that many are targeted. It's not sort of a statistical accident. Of course, if it's a statistical accident, that's actually worse because that means they're just indiscriminately bombing people.
Right.
But they are deliberately targeting journalists. And yet our analysis of that coverage found that the mention of children was in headlines. Well, we'll start with journalists. The mention of journalists, reporters, and photojournalists out of 1,000, with over 1,100 articles, there had only been 9 mentions of journalists, and only 4 of those were specifically about Palestinian journalists. And there had only been 2 mentions of children in the headlines of an analysis of over 1,100. There was one sort of report in the New York Times, and then one in the Washington Post, and that was pretty much it. That focused on specifically the sort of wide scale killing of children, which at that point had been about 6,000, and I think is now considered to be somewhere between the range of 12,000 and 14,000 children. These are people under the age of 18 who have been killed by these Israeli bombs, and that is just not existent. It's put in these medical terms. It's put in these kind of anodyne terms. And
Right.
we thought that asymmetry was worth highlighting because I know a lot of activists had done more qualitative analysis, looking at headlines and framing, and it's fairly obvious that there is a systemic bias for many reasons, which we can get into, sort of general chauvinism, general racism towards Muslims, who obviously are a racialized group in the American press. And the fact that, of course, the U.S. has bipartisan consensus to buy, pay for, fund, and supply these bombs that are killing them. So obviously cognitive dissonance would require us to downplay and to sort of whereas the death of those who are seen like us is put in these more tabloid, more evocative terms, when that's simply not the case for the bombardment. There's sort of one example. This is by David Ignatius at the Washington Post, which kind of sums this up in one sentence, which I think is probably worth reading. If you'll indulge me for a second.
Please.
And he wrote, quote, "The war has produced deeply horrifying images. Israeli children assaulted in barbaric ways by Hamas terrorists, Palestinian children left to die under Israeli bombardment." So here we have horrific, we have Israeli children assaulted in barbaric ways by Hamas terrorists versus Palestinian children have been left to die, presumably by their Palestinian parents, under Israeli bombardment. And so one has this sort of active emotive language, a deliberate intent, and the other is seen as being passive and kind of an unfortunate sort of secondary or tertiary result.
The idea, to the extent that they're even involved in that second part of the clause, is non-barbarically leaving the children to die in the graveyard. It's really unconscionable. That's a perfect example to bring up. And I want to go back to something you said a little bit ago, is that people have been doing really amazing kind of more qualitative analysis of these headlines. Another example that springs to mind is, I think it was on the same day, a Palestinian child, death was described as a young woman being killed at the same time that IDF soldiers who happened to be women were described as girls being killed. And that is the contrast that's been so galling to people. However, I think what is especially useful about this analysis that you've done with the Intercept is that it takes any kind of subjectivity that anyone might bring to bear on those phrases completely out of the question by looking at this in a really quantitative way that is in some ways more revealing. So, for example, you write in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, the words Israeli or Israel appear more than Palestinian or variations thereof, even as Palestinian deaths far outpaced Israeli deaths. For every 2 Palestinian deaths, Palestinians are mentioned once. For every Israeli death, Israelis are mentioned 8 times, or a rate of 16 times more per death. Yeah, go ahead.
And that's largely a product of the fact that the death rate just massively began to outpace October 7th, which is a threshold to cross roughly in the week and a half, if not less. And so as the death rate became what is 10x, 15x, by the time our report was done, it was about 12x. Now it's something around the 21, 22x. One would expect to see some corresponding coverage, but there was a deliberate effort, I think, based probably internally would be done in the kind of altar of balance to say, well, we have to keep talking about October 7th. Now, of course, October 7th was horrific, and it was in many ways a slaughter, and it's important to cover obviously such a big event. No one would sort of say you shouldn't, but there was an effort as the body count became so obscenely asymmetrical to sort of continue to discuss it in these kind of terms, with kind of new information being leaked out by Israeli officials, to sort of give the impression that these are kind of 2 ongoing conflicts. Now, historically, in these what Israel calls mowing the grass, this is obviously a far more severe version. Previously, the worst was the 50 plus days 2014 Operation Protective Edge that killed, according to UN estimates, 1,481 civilians. Now, the total Israelis who died in that conflict was according to the same count 6. So I think one of them was a heart attack. So typically there has not been that much that many Israeli deaths. This sort of October 7th was, in that sense, unprecedented, like not even close. And I think that is why, of course, in many ways, there's this arbitrary number of asymmetric deaths as per the logic of mowing the grass that has to be achieved before this ends one of 2 ways, which again I argue in The Nation in a separate piece. It either ends with full-blown ethnic cleansing, or it ends with them just stopping at some arbitrarily high number of dead Palestinians, with effectively a Hamas or Hamas-like entity still in power of what remains of Gaza. And this is always how it's going to be. The idea that there's this plot to sort of hunt for Hamas or eliminate Hamas or overthrow Hamas is a fiction that exists within almost exclusively U.S. media. It doesn't even really exist in Israeli media in key ways. I think they're a little less deluded about this kind of regime change op where, some unknown, which is, again, there's a report every week about how Israel is unclear about its post-war plans. And of course, there's a reason why they're unclear about their post-war plans, because their post-war plans are either A, there's not a Gaza left, or B, effectively the people in charge are still in charge and Israel withdraws because they can't stand the internal pressure from both soldiers dying, which has been a few hundred, and of course the hostages are still being held by Hamas and PIJ and other entities. And so this sort of idea that there's this targeted zero dark 30 hunt for Hamas kind of, and one saw this framing time and time again, as I wrote, now almost a month and a half ago at The Nation, this kind of zero dark 30ification of the coverage, that anytime there was a hospital where the IDF said there was a tunnel or something, they framed it as like they were storming the compound of bin Laden. And meanwhile, of course, they show up and there's no Hamas fighters and there's not an underground command and control center. It's Al-Shifa Hospital specifically. This kind of bond layer 3D graphic they showed where, it's kind of Dr. No with all these tunnels and bunkers ends up being total bullshit. But this desire to sort of frame it as this targeted clinical hunt for Hamas has served as cover for what is effectively just a campaign of collective punishment, mass death, and the militarization of 2.2 million people, the vast majority of whom, of course, are civilians.
Yeah, you and Nima Shirazi did an amazing breakdown specifically of this hunt for Hamas framing on, was it on the episode I listened to on the way home from work this morning? Specifically talking about how, as a David Leonhardt in the Times goes out of his way, his entire kind of editorial project is providing a reframing for quote unquote well-meaning liberal consumers of the New York Times that serves as justification for what would shock the conscience of a normal person, i.e., troops are surrounding a hospital that doctors have said they cannot evacuate per evacuation orders because of their oath to take care of patients that cannot be moved, including a number of babies in a NICU. They're ultimately forced to leave under the claim that we have to get you out because Hamas is in the basement. They find no Hamas in the basement. It's a complete non-starter of a story. Meanwhile, the coverage of the babies that are not only left to die, but left so long that they begin to decompose and rot, get a passing mention, whereas we're still getting rounds and rounds of lies about beheaded babies and 40 dead babies and all of these things on the other side that weren't even true.
To be clear, the babies who were left to die was actually a different hospital, but it's the same.
Sure.
It's the same logic. And many NICU babies did die at Al Shifa. But this is how one has to kind of view a lot of centrist or liberal official coverage of this conflict, which is, and I think the way this manifests internally in terms of how they talk about it at editorial meetings, I don't know for sure, but I suspect, is that there's it's framed in the sense that we don't want to be too salacious or too tabloidy, and we have to sort of put it in these less sensationalist terms, and this is why I think that desire to sort of use the Zero Dark 30 framework for what was clearly just attacking a hospital, because on October 13th, Israel issued an evacuation order for all of northern Gaza. It's clear as day. You can go read it in Hebrew and Arabic. It's online. It was reported by every media outlet. They called the hospital and said, you need to leave. And they called them several times. And they called Al Shifa Hospital dozens of times and says, there's an evacuation order. You have to leave. And then they carried out that evacuation order to the letter. They did exactly what they said they were going to do. And they didn't care. They were not making a distinction per this evacuation order of who was a Hamas militant, where the Hamas militants were, and who civilians were. They didn't care because to them, everybody who remained after the evacuation order of a couple days or whatever it ended up being was per se considered a terrorist or a terrorist sort of combatant. And so when they did this whole hunt for Hamas thing while they were attacking hospitals, it was like, well, they're just attacking the hospital because they said they were going to do that. They called them the day before and said they were going to do that. But sort of acknowledging that this was an evacuation order, which is sort of obviously overlaps with ethnic cleansing, which is precisely what they were doing to North Gaza and can of course continue to do. Now that they've admitted they're building a buffer zone, which is to say they're annexing about 1/8 of the land of Gaza, if not more, which is now what they've admitted they're doing. This is not sort of a speculation. Obviously, the further right plan, which is still very much a threat, is to just try to force population transfers outside of Gaza altogether, of most of them, by making it unlivable. And they've contacted various countries in Africa, they've contacted North America, they've contacted countries in Europe trying to get them to move out. So we had all this evidence that they were trying to do forcible population transfers. Netanyahu reported in the Washington Post by John Hudson, said Netanyahu was basically going around saying they want to ship, quote unquote, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians out of Gaza, which is another way of saying virtually the whole population. Whether or not they wanted to resettle it or just turn it into a wasteland, who knows? My guess is it would come in stages. That was considered too sort of salacious, even though we had all this evidence. The intelligence minister on November 19th wrote an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post in English saying, here's why we should kick Palestinians out of Gaza. Of course, they framed it as humanitarian resettlement or whatever, but that's how which is ethnic cleansing. That's by definition what it is. And it was seen as sort of too provocative. And so the most generous,
not Israel, you couldn't, they made that kind of charge against a good guy like Israel.
No. Yeah. And of course it's totally asymmetrical, right? Because if any baddie country, Russia, China, Iran, were doing any of this stuff, it would have had the most ungenerous, salacious interpretation of events. But because Israel is effectively a client state of the US, everything is sort of toned down. And the extent to which there is something that is provocative, it is buried. When CNN did the report about the babies who had been left to die, I think about a month ago, the headline you would know. It was like, you know, figuring out the truth of what happened at this hospital. It's some sort of very kind of New Yorker vague, wishy-washy headline. And then you read it and they're reporting, and I think quite substantially, and the IDF didn't even bother to refute it, that the IDF had told the doctors at the hospital that they were going to send an ambulance service if they evacuated. Because the doctor said, we can't leave, we have patients here. And they said, don't worry about that, leave, we promise we'll send an ambulance. And they never did. And during the 7-day truce, reporters went in there and found these decomposing babies. Now, if this was any baddie country, if this was something, again, that Russia did in Ukraine or China did or whoever, we would have had, you know, the most tabloid headline. It would have said, you know, occupying military leaves babies to decompose, and, you know, despite what they said, because this was confirmed by multiple sources and the IDF didn't even bother denying it. And so time and time again, we get these horrific stories, the horrific, you know, images, and everything is sort of keeping the temperature down, keep the tone down. Of course, you have the cry bullying from the hospital bombing on October 17th, where there was some ambiguity about whether or not it was a misfired PIJ rocket,
Right.
Or whether or not it was a bomb or an Israeli shell.
Which all seems very quaint now that every hospital in northern Gaza is gone, and almost every hospital in the entire Gaza Strip.
Well, it's also interesting that the New York Times had an analysis of the Hamas and PIJ rockets that went into Israel and found that found that 12,000 had been fired and roughly, I think roughly 1,500 had landed, and they had killed 12 people. So 1,500 rockets landed in Israel, exploded in Israel, quote unquote, in Israel, killed 12 people. But one errant PIJ rocket from October 17th misfired and killed 200 to 300 people. So that's pretty bad luck, statistically speaking. But that is the story that we were told, that then therefore justified why for the rest of the quote unquote conflict, we can never ascribe any responsibility for Israel. And then I think when they saw, one more thing, sorry. I think when they saw the protests in all the major cities in Lebanon, in Iraq, there was attacks on various Israeli embassies, and unfortunately there was just, you know, horrific, stupid, you know, anti-Semitic attacks as well. I think once they saw the sort of response to the hospital bombing on October 17th, I think there was a sense of like, oh, we have to keep this temperature down regardless of what Israel does. And I think one of the reasons why so much of this horrific stuff is constantly being spun and reframed and put in anodyne terms is because there's a general sense of like, look, Biden's made his decision. This is happening with or without global outrage. So it's our job as editors and TV producers to kind of make sure the temperature doesn't get too high. And so that's why there's this pathological avoidance, because again, when you describe the reality of what's going on in clear and uncertain terms, it's just the brain can't comprehend it because
because there's no shading it. I mean, one thing that I've experienced is there's been some pressure. I don't have a problem saying this, at the Hill, to have more pro-Zionist perspectives represented on the show. But two things are happening. Despite the lies that were printed in a Jewish Insider hit piece on me about this, we routinely try to get people with a Zionist perspective to join panels with someone who has more of a humanitarian pro-Palestinian perspective. And they drop out and they say, well, we can't debate that person because they're anti-Semitic or whatever it is. These people are often Jewish, by the way, that they're describing as anti-Semitic. Or in the alternative, we had a guest on earlier this week. He made his case. But I think what's really disconcerting to perhaps the people in management is that the audience is just not buying what they're saying. Most people can open their eyes and see a news report like the one that came out just today of a Palestinian father, purveyor of children's clothing, who, after giving an interview to Western press, turned with white flag in hand, walked toward where his family members were to try to evacuate them. And we all saw on camera him getting shot in cold blood by the IDF. And I wanted to ask you specifically about the Biden press agent's response to a question, I think really good, thorough questioning about that incident. I don't know if you've had a chance to watch it, but we can pull it up here for you to respond to, because it's really remarkable. How do you do spin when your eyes are showing you images as haunting and clear as this one?
Yeah, go ahead in the back. Yeah,
you may have had the chance to see some of the footage shot by our cameraman in the Gaza Strip, widely shared online, showing a group of men waving a white flag, representing no threat whatsoever, unarmed, and moving south to try and reach some relatives. The IDF opened fire, as you can see on that video, and killed one of them, Abu Salul. I wonder what your response to that is, and whether you think from watching that video whether that potentially represents a war crime.
I have seen that footage, but I am not going to comment on the specifics around that, given I'm not aware of the full circumstances on the ground. And as we've said before, this is not an American operation. But beyond that, please don't. I'm happy to take your questions if you'll allow me. To answer. I don't interrupt you, and I ask you to not do the same. As a general matter, though, we have not parsed our words about the moral and strategic imperative that the government of Israel and the Israeli security forces have to take every effort possible to minimize civilian casualties and minimize impact on civilians. As it relates to the footage that your organization has shared, again, I'm just going to refrain from commenting on specific operations, as we do not have full circumstances of what on the ground from here. This isn't an American operation. I'm not on the ground there to speak to the full parameters of the situation. Any civilian death is heartbreaking, and any civilian life lost is one too many. And we have made that clear with the Israelis, and will continue to do so.
Beyond that comment about it being heartbreaking, which is a platitude we often hear, would you urge, given that you broadly support IDF operations in the Gaza Strip, would you support a Israeli investigation of what happened in that video? Given that they're waving a white flag and they represented no threat.
That is for the IDF to undertake and determine based on the circumstances of that situation. What I will say is that we have been clear to our Israeli partners that they need to take every possible measure to avoid civilian harm during an operation and investigate credible allegations of law or of war violations when they arise. But that is for our Israeli partners in the IDF to speak to.
At what cost the soul? I mean, what are you going to get? The board of directors at Boeing? What's the payoff here, really, for that shit? I mean, that's
apparently, according to the account that posted that guy, that press sec used to work for Rashida Tlaib. So the churn is crazy in DC. Souls were sold.
Those juicy State Department jobs. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is, again, when we there's that obviously famous clip of John Kirby faking, like, holding back tears, talking about Ukraine being attacked by Russia, and then there's the montage of him just denying Israel as it even exists. He's sort of, what's Israel really? It's more of a suggestion. And this is, these crocodile tears, all the feigned. I mean, the last 4 months have really, obviously, if the idea of American liberal world order or any of that kind of fatuous sort of self-aggrandizing sloganeering about human rights or democracy, if that had any purchase within certain quarters of the global South, or frankly, the global North, that's all gone. I mean, if it was 15% credible before, now it's asymptotically low, because there's not any way you can look at these totally dead-eyed press secretaries and then you juxtapose it with how they talk about other countries. When they speak about baddie countries, it's done in these absolute moral terms. Everybody becomes Justice Jackson at the Nuremberg trials. It's this and this and moral certainty and these crimes, and this is a genocide, and this is. And then when they ask them about Israel committing, like, on camera obvious war crimes, they're just bumbling interns. They don't what's going on, where are my glasses? I'll get back to you on that. I left my wallet in the car. They're sort of, nobody buys this, because, again, this is why Tony Blinken sort of continues to power through with all the kind of liberal rules-based order claptrap, because it's just not credible. And to the extent to which the liberal establishment has given pushback on Israel's war crimes, leaked through people like David Ignatius, who's actually run a couple pieces, because he's the official mouthpiece of the CIA. He's run a couple pieces that were like, hey, maybe time out a little bit. Why don't we let this hostage exchange thing go on longer? Kind of like a sort of subtle nudge of, like, is that it's completely ruining all these pretenses, because all the liberal rules-based order moral grandstanding is not just for internal propaganda in terms of domestic population and external propaganda, although I don't think it's very credible in other countries. It's also for the people who work there. Something like 60, 70,000 people work at a State Department, 2.5 million, 3 million people work in the Defense Department. Like, you can't run this large military empire that's currently running military operations in a half a dozen countries in the Middle East and bombing 4 countries and has 800 plus military bases. You can't really operate that without some kind of moral narrative to justify it. And
Yes.
because nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm the bad guy. And this is something we routinely accept, again, for countries we view as being batty. It's like people in the Russian, diplomatic and military establishment don't wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to do evil today. They have a kind of internal logic, an internal justification for it. And so this conflict, this sort of asymmetrical, horrific bombing, evidence of genocide, evidence of ethnic cleansing, while Biden supports it 100%, while the U.S. establishment, both Republican and Democrat, support it 100%, has just completely evaporated any kind of credibility that they may have gotten from, say,
Yeah, let me ask you about that. I think that's a really important point. It's a mask off moment. And the rest of that clip shows journalists becoming increasingly adept at asking follow-up questions that reveal how off the mask is, saying things like, okay, well, it's up to Israel, it's up to IDF to investigate. Have you followed up with them? Have you asked them about their plans to investigate? Are you getting follow-up?
Police department investigating itself. It's a joke.
Right. But even that, the answers are even that is not something that it's clear the U.S. is willing to ask, even if it's performative, even if we know the answers were. And the kind of feet holding to fire that eventually led, after about a year, to Israel admitting that the IDF had killed Shireen Abu Akleh, for instance. It doesn't even seem like there's any interest in pushing in that way. And perhaps the apotheosis of this kind of mask off, I don't know if you caught this hearing in Vermont. There was a Burlington City Council meeting where a young girl was arguing against the idea of using any kind of Holocaust analogy, which had been raised by either a Holocaust survivor or the child of a Holocaust survivor, to talk about why the siege on Gaza was a war crime, unethical, and should be stopped. She accidentally made a slip of the tongue. Did you happen to catch this? It was a young girl who was testifying on behalf of.
It seemed like she was a kid, so I didn't really make hay of it. But not that makes it okay, but.
No, but the reason it went viral because it's another example of this mask offing, where she said inadvertently, I'm appalled that people are bringing up the Holocaust. Do not use other genocides to describe this one.
And I would like to use the rest of my time to say how appalled I am that people are bringing up the Holocaust. Do not use other genocides to describe this one. I have been...
Yeah, unfortunate turn of phrase, but I sort of...
Right, and the audience reacts because she accidentally acknowledged that that's exactly what's happening here in Gaza, a genocide. But more to your point, you've been talking about how I think the pressure that these journalists are putting on the State Department and on the Biden administration is perhaps creating new narrative developments to try to put some cognitive, rhetorical distance between the Biden administration and the worst humanitarian abuses, news of the worst humanitarian abuses that are coming out of Gaza. You wrote on Twitter describing this phenomenon, words like signs of new strain and testing patience being used to characterize the relationship between Joe Biden and Netanyahu. But you seem to be articulating some skepticism as to whether or not there is real strain or that Biden is offering any real pushback to Netanyahu. Can you get into that a little bit?
Oh, it's total theater. I mean, I documented the days that the U.S. supposedly raised concerns about civilian casualties, and I think my last count was October. Let's see here. I'll give you a full list here if you'll indulge me here. It was because I wrote it in my Nation piece, and of course it's since been updated because now there's actually more here. So the U.S. issued quote unquote pressured Israel on civilians October 11th, October 15th, October 29th, October 31st, November 3rd, November 10th, November 29th, December 2nd, December 6th, December 11th, December 14th, December 18th, December 23rd, January 6th, January 14th, January 21st, and then just yesterday, January 24th, according to The Hill. They did it again. And in this time, the violence has not stopped. It fluctuates here and there, but overall it's the same. Obviously, it's gotten much worse because of increased hunger and famine and disease. And of course, the destruction of the medical facilities means secondary and sort of tertiary deaths and complications during birth. It's unimaginable, the horror. Even CNN, Christina Amanpour had a story today about it that was pretty good, actually. She kind of occasionally will do something good. After I have a toddler after the 17th time if I tell him to do something and there's no consequences. He knows he could sort of keep doing it. That's usually how it works. Of course, Israel's not a toddler. But the fact that but it's the same sort of, you're getting walked over here. And I think intentionally, there's kind of a narrative as well that like, Netanyahu is managing Biden, or Biden's somehow being manipulated. And I think a lot of that even kind of veers into anti-Semitic understandings of how the relationship works, that somehow the U.S. is being manipulated by pro-Israel forces rather than them just being another client state of a much bigger, much wealthier country. And I think that permits this idea that Joe Biden is somehow being bumbled or tricked into this. And it's like, no, it's just the theater of leaks. I mean, if you look at the sources on all these stories, they're all from people in the Biden White House, or they're from people in Israel, the sort of Netanyahu circles leaking it to kind of do them a favor, to get the heat off of them a little bit. They're not real. There is no pressure. There's sort of rhetorical pressure. There's kind of like, I'm sure in some meetings they may hand wring about the optics of it. In Axios, when they were negotiating the sort of humanitarian pause, quote unquote, Axios did a story where Blinken explicitly said, if you do this humanitarian pause, it'll buy you more time to sort of carry out what you want to do. So the humanitarian rhetoric, even letting in flour or whatever it is in the limited capacity, is always framed as like, it'll buy you more time for your quote unquote war on Hamas. That they're, to the extent they're worried about civilian deaths, they're worried about the optics, they're worried about public sentiment. And we know this because if they cared about civilian deaths, they would support a ceasefire, and they would have supported a ceasefire on October 8th, because everyone knows where this was going to go. Everyone knew what was going to happen. Everyone knows 25,000, 30,000, 35,000 probably projected are going to die. Now, experts are saying more people are going to die of probably disease and hunger in the next few months than died from bombs specifically. And you did not need to be clairvoyant to know that. And so this whole theater, this kind of, I wrote a piece about this for Real News, like this whole sort of concern theater that they do. And they did this with Saudi Arabia too. We continue to sell them weapons, $750 million package in 2021. And everyone says, oh, Biden's, he called him a pariah in the campaign, and now he's giving him weapons because the Ukraine invasion made oil prices go up or something. It's like, no, like he's always supported Saudi Arabia, just like Obama supported Saudi Arabia, just like the U.S. supported Saudi Arabia's bombing of Yemen for 7 years. All that changed was rhetoric. Like the fundamental nature of these relationships doesn't change because they are client states of U.S. imperial interest, to put it in sort of maybe harsh lefty terms, but that's what it is. This is not an interpersonal kind of back and forth between two guys who have personality disputes. There are fundamental forces here at work. Now, do I think around the margins there's some differences, or there's some pushback? Do I think maybe a different president would have given him such carte blanche support, even say, for example, Obama, even for example, Hillary Clinton? I actually don't. I think maybe not. I think this is, to the extent to which it's 100% versus 94%. Maybe there is some differences.
Well, it's an interesting question, because I have heard people make the argument that Joe Biden's 50-year career in the public office demonstrates that he doesn't just have the same kind of bipartisan blob support of Israel, but that he seems to have an ideological personal commitment to Israel.
He does.
And there has been a lot of reporting about how president after president, Republican or Democrat, have found Netanyahu interpersonally to be difficult, smug, acting as though he has outsized influence and power, and really irritating to American presidents who see him as a big bully. That being said, those ideological differences, the political differences, the various degrees to which people like or don't like Bibi Netanyahu hasn't changed the fundamental relationship between Israel and the United States in all this time. Trump calling himself an anti-interventionist hasn't changed the fact that while he was president, he continued to send $3.8 billion to Israel every year. And a lot of these differences are purely cosmetic. Obama can say in some memoir somewhere that he hated Netanyahu. What difference does it ultimately make? And that's the fundamental issue here, right? That if Biden did want to put pressure on Netanyahu, we can all conceive of ways to do so. Threaten aid, condition aid on not violating humanitarian laws, not expressing some support for Bernie Sanders' well-meaning yet meager effort to at least get Congress to require some investigation into whether or not Israel was committing war crimes. Not having your UN representative veto resolutions for a ceasefire or for, again, UN investigations into X, Y, and Z, including these rape allegations that have been so central to the Israeli case in front of the ICJ and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, Politico reported that one of the reasons why the White House was skeptical of a significant quote unquote pause prior to it happening in late November was that reporters would have better access to Gaza and reveal what was going on in terms of the
Right.
mass carnage, in terms of like, and obviously the reporters in Gaza, but they're saying outside reporters, which is to say reporters that the New York Times will listen to or CNN will listen to, because Palestinian journalists in their minds don't count as journalists, even though again over 100 of them have died, 120 of them have died reporting on the conflict. And that ended up being what happened.
Let's not buy into their passive voice. Have been massacred, shall we even say?
I think a great deal of them have been deliberately targeted,
Yeah.
as have many, obviously, academics, intellectuals, media personalities, writers, tons of people who are kind of part of the intelligentsia on Gaza have been deliberately targeted. And that ended up being what happened, because again, they found the decomposing baby story that went viral, which led to much shock and outrage, despite no matter how much it was downplayed. And I think there's a similar dynamic going on, which is when you get to a certain point, they're kind of pot committed. They're pot committed to this ethnic cleansing policy, because if they sort of stopped, it would be an admission that in some Hamas-like entity remains in power, which is of course what's going to happen, because Israel cannot occupy and defeat a population in that way. It's sort of similar to the U.S.'s war on the Taliban. It's not quite the same, but many of the same dynamics in terms of like, the fundamental problem is that you're an occupying power and you can't just sort of hang out. And there's all this sort of shadow boxing about bringing in the Saudis to some Arab, because to them Arabs are all kind of interchangeable, even though Saudi Arabia has a approval rating in Gaza of less than 5%.
Hence, send them to an Arab country. Why can't the Gazans go to one of their own people's countries?
And they keep talking about Mohammed bin Salman like he's the sort of Pope of the Arabs, as if like he's at all relevant to what's going on, other than the fact that he can write checks. And I think that they're sort of committed to that, because it would be an acknowledgement. Because if Israel pulls out now, or let's say Biden calls for a ceasefire tomorrow, and they'll say, well, wait a second, Hamas or some Hamas-like entity is still in power of what's left of Gaza. So what was the point? Why? And they'll give some claptrap about how they diminished their capacity, which they do every time they mow the grass. They did this in 2014, 2021, 2018, 2009. They have to have some victory. So they'll say, oh, well, we diminished their capacity. That's what they said in 2021. Of course, how did that end up happening, right? And then there has to be some face-saving narrative. And it seems like one face-saving narrative potentially here is the release of the remaining 100 plus hostages. 150 hostages that remain in Gaza, that the pressure to do that could provide us a pretext to say, okay, we're wrapping it up and we're going home. When the reality, of course, is that they're just dying. Too many Israelis are dying in combat. And also, I think there's a general sense that Netanyahu is broadly unpopular. But I think that just the other day, and I wrote about this for my Substack, that Tony Blinken was reported by Andrea Mitchell in NBC News saying, "quote unquote," there is no military solution to Hamas, which is actually a shocking admission that should have been a much bigger story. Because if there's no military solution to Hamas, then what the fuck have we been doing for the last 4 months? Right. Because if you're gonna say there's no military solution, you're effectively acknowledging there has to be a political solution, which could have happened on October 8th. And this is what people say, well, how would you respond to October 7th? Well, there's existential issues with the occupation, the siege, and the starvation of Gaza and the military, the almost 60-year military occupation of the West Bank that require a good faith political solution. Apartheid states are necessarily going to have this as an existential problem, something that Blinken himself, right? This is someone who supports the war, supports the arming and funding of Israel, acknowledges, because everybody knows it's the case. This is not like sort of rarefied left-wing information. This is sort of accepted wisdom. And I think the Secretary of State acknowledging that there is no military solution to Hamas and that there needs to be a political solution, while at the same time funding and arming a totally fruitless and pointless, by their own logic, obviously killing Palestinians for a lot of people is an incident of itself, but by their logic, right? Because the only way you can justify 30, 40,000, 50, 60,000 dead people, 15,000, 20,000 dead children is to say, well, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. There's some political solution. There's some political goal. We're going to overthrow Hamas, right? So when you acknowledge you can't do that, and that you've been killing people purely based on some revenge, like there's some number they have somewhere in Tel Aviv or in Washington of some arbitrarily high number of dead Palestinian children, where you say, okay, we've gotten our Bronze Age recompense, we can stop now, which is how it's always been previously. Like every other conflict, again, 09, 14, 18, 21, there's always some arbitrary number they have somewhere where it's like, all right, we've done enough damage. It's time to close up shop, right? In 2021, when Biden called Netanyahu, said, you've killed enough people, you're done. That number exists somewhere. And this is why every liberal at some point will support a ceasefire. This is why all this hand-wringing about the ceasefire this and how it's a fringe left position, despite the fact that 153 countries voted in support of it and only 10 opposed it. Despite the fact that every humanitarian organization on earth, every international aid organization, Amnesty International, Oxfam, all support it. That aside, and the reason why it's the thing people rally around is because it's going to happen. Again, short of full-blown ethnic cleansing. The question is, when is it going to happen? Is it going to happen at 500 dead kids, 5,000 dead kids, 50,000 dead kids? And that's always been the central question. And that's that's the nihilism at the heart of this Biden policy, because everybody knows it. And Blinken effectively, again, assuming that quote is, or rather the paraphrasing of his position is correct, everybody knows it, including the Secretary of State.
Yeah, and Blinken isn't the only one who's made a statement like that. There was an Israeli either spokesperson or military official who similarly said there's no military solution to Hamas. This is an open secret, and I take your point really well. To your point about what that number is and the question of civilian deaths, as you've discussed and written about at length, the creating skepticism around whether or not we can trust these quote unquote Hamas generated numbers has been used to soften the blow of these death tolls, which, as you pointed out, are now 20 plus X of the people who were killed on October 7th. And we have been kind of stalled out at this 25,000 number, seemingly because Israel has obliterated all of the mechanisms to keep track of deaths in the country, whether it's hospitals and medical staff, whether it is UN staff. Over 100 humanitarian workers have been killed, a statistically anomalously high number in the history of the United Nations, bombing every mosque in northern Gaza, religious institutions, dredging up 16 graveyards, any kind of infrastructure that you could think of that could keep track of death tolls has been attacked in substantive ways. So I wanted you to speak to this other new revelation that's come up, which is that Israel has admitted that absent any other tools that they have that are better to what these Hamas-run agencies have come up with, that they too are relying on those Hamas death numbers, that they've probed them a little to see how accurate they are, and they find them. Israel finds those numbers to be accurate.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, this is why it's always anyone who follows Israel-Palestine when John Kirby and Biden denied the numbers. The reason why it was so vulgar. And if you follow any of these reportings about Arab and Muslim and Palestinian anger at Biden, the number one thing they all say, aside from the actual, of course, support of the ethnic cleansing campaign, is the public denying of the numbers. That was sort of seen as uniquely offensive because these were numbers that the State Department for years relied on.
Right.
Because the Palestinian health ministry, obviously everything by definition is run by Hamas or something Hamas-like within Gaza. Is run by Hamas, but a lot of the civil servants, like the dog catcher or whatever, sort of you and I would interpret as like normal civil servant roles, are not like some evil, sinister terrorist output. I mean, they're fairly reliable, and we know this because because groups like Human Rights Watch have vouched for them. The U.S. State Department has used them for years, since 2006, 2007, more importantly, they've been measured against the IDF's own numbers in previous conflicts, and they were off by less than 7%. These are not significant differences, and everybody knew that. And when John Kirby denied it, he knew what he was doing. He realized the desperation of the situation. He realized Biden was going to get destroyed in many liberal circles over this, and it was going to harm him politically. So they really did the only thing you could do, which is doing a very kind of Trumpian alternative facts. Let's just sort of use innuendo to sow doubt, but not really commit to it. And then reportedly, when he met with so-called Muslim leaders, Biden apologized in private for denying those numbers, has yet to do so in public. But this was the thing where he did it, and it was like, I'm a pretty jaded man. I've been doing this a long time. I'm quite cynical. I have a pretty black heart. And even I was like, wow, I cannot believe. I know being surprised or not being surprised is not a particularly interesting observation, but I was genuinely taken aback that they had, you do it once, you sort of issue a quiet statement saying, we maybe overstated a little bit, but they kept doing it over and over and over again. And I was like, oh, this is the policy now they're doing. This is the kind of dead-eyed, just deliberate lying that they knew was not true. And that was when it was like I think for a lot of people where they really were like, I'm done with this fucking guy. This is, it's almost sort of like you're denying the basic humanity of what's happening. And the idea that somehow those numbers were not, and again, they're almost certainly an undercount. They're almost certainly an undercount. Israel's dropped 30,000 bombs in the first 45 days. The idea that they have that they killed 0.75 people per bomb is absurd. It's almost certainly higher, especially when you include things like disease and starvation and secondary and third order, deaths. Excess deaths are almost certainly way higher. And everyone who's looked at it will say that. And then to sort of say the Hamas run, all the sort of innuendo that's entailed in that, without mentioning that these, again, are backed up by groups like Human Rights Watch. They're backed up by the U.S. State Department for years, was really a cynicism both from the White House and a lot of centrist press, because they would do that. They pivoted. They started saying Hamas run, CNN always says Hamas run. And what purpose does that serve? If you want to say Hamas run, fine, but follow it up by saying like, oh, and vouched for by Israeli intelligence, vouched for by Human Rights Watch, vouched for by a ton of Western observers, to the extent to which Palestinians are just not reliable, because they're all terrorist and evil. Like if you make these, even if you buy into these racist assumptions about the sort of pejorative of Hamas run, Western organizations, including the State Department, for years use these numbers because they're historically extremely reliable. And then they published the list of the actual names. Because again, Israel knows where everyone is. They all have ID numbers. Didn't matter. And I think that was really where a lot of people, that was a level of cynicism that I think was unprecedented, I think, for a lot of people in this political moment. No matter how cynical one can be, I think that was where it was like, oh, they're not just going, because that was also a signal like, oh, they're gonna go all out on this. Like, this is not a like, get it out of your system, we'll wrap this up in a month. This is like a 6-month to 9-month ethnic cleansing campaign, genocide, and they're just fucking pot committed, because again, Biden's a ideologically committed Zionist who believes in, again, for various kind of racist reasons or sentimental reasons, believes in this, what they're doing. And
so the next thing going forward, and I've seen you talk about this as well, obviously, is the buffer zones. So the State Department has said that we don't support any diminishment in the area, the territory of Gaza. However, there is this new language of buffer zones that the press seems to be treating very credibly. The idea that for the defense of Israel, there needs to be a permanent, quasi-permanent area on the border of Gaza that is under Israeli control. Of course, the 20+ Israeli soldiers that were killed most recently, and I think was the largest one-day death toll, died as they were setting charges to blow up residential houses to create this buffer zone. An RPG hit their explosives, which ended up killing, I believe, 24 members of the IDF. And the question of whether or not what they were engaged in, creating this buffer zone, whether that was legitimate wartime, quote unquote, defensive activity, has largely gone unremarked upon in the press, as the press, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
A buffer zone is just an annexation of land. You can call it, whatever you want to call it, but it's an annexation of roughly an eighth or even as much as a seventh, depending how it ends up being defined, of Palestinian territory. And this is the bare minimum, right? There's still many people who fear that they'll just occupy the entire north of Gaza. I think perhaps getting rid of Gaza altogether is not on the cards, given the high death tolls among Israeli soldiers. But you're annexing land you're blowing up civilian homes, which is explicitly a war crime to the extent one even believes that's a thing anymore. And then you're taking the land and making it Israeli land, occupied land. These things are, again, post World War II Rome Statute. These are sort of textbook war crimes. But you call it a buffer zone, it sounds like, hey, we're just putting up a little bumper. It's no big deal. No, this is a large percentage of the agricultural land in Gaza. That's how they grow food. And we know that Israel has used caloric restrictions as a criteria for disciplining the population of Gaza for years. They've explicitly said as much. They quote unquote, we're going to put them on a diet, was a famous sort of just enough to survive. And measuring caloric intake among Palestinians in Gaza is a part of how they manage that threat. And have for years. So the idea that they would occupy, lots of their land, their agricultural land for the purposes of a quote unquote buffer zone. Of course, the rational person would say, well, why don't you build a buffer zone on the other side of Israel? And the
Right.
reason is that they obviously want to come away with this with land that's been annexed to diminish and humiliate and exact revenge against the civilian population. Because again, the entire logic of this quote unquote war has been collective punishment. This is just another vehicle for collective punishment. And that's what.
And of course, Israel has done the opposite of created a buffer zone on the other side, choosing last minute to move this festival right adjacent to what an open air prison struck many people as tone deaf, to say the least, and ultimately very dangerous to the people who were attending it. I want to ask you, as someone who evaluates spin, whether you've given any thought to what's going to happen on Friday. The ICJ is set to deliver an interim ruling on South Africa's genocide case. Obviously, we don't know which direction it's going to go in. Some people are concerned that if the ICJ were to find no finding of genocide, that it could be disastrous and be rhetorically used to say, nothing to see here, folks, let Israel have another month or 6 at continuing its ongoing practices. Alternatively, if there is a finding of genocide, it is an interim finding that could be waved away in various ways. Have you given much thought to what kind of the best and worst case scenarios are out of Friday's ruling?
I haven't, because I don't know what's going to happen. I try not to make predictions in this business. But I do think the spin and the reception will be something I'll be sure to note and comment on. But the actual findings themselves, obligatory. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a simple country media critic. It seems like to me they've met several criteria of genocide, up to and including the clear as day genocidal statements. I'm
And
just
what about the coverage of the ICJ hearings so far? I know a lot was made of the fact that the BBC covered the Israeli argument on the Friday of the 2-day hearing without covering South Africa's argument on the Thursday of that 2-day hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been largely played down. I mean, I haven't done any work to quantify that, but from my perspective, it's kind of seen as a sideshow. Again, I think it goes without saying that it would be a lot more front and center in the media, because it has been covered, but it's sort of like a D section, page 7 kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems small because you can't not cover it. It's obviously big enough news to cover, but it's not given great import. Whereas again, if this was some other country, I think a batty country, it would be the front page news every day. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how people respond to it in either direction. Obviously these decisions are going to be political. These are not sort of dispassionate, bodies sort of overseeing it outside of the obviously the stakes of what it would mean to find that. So
Yeah.
I don't put a ton of weight in it. I think in some senses, even airing out these genocidal statements in the context of a court such that it has been very, I would say, intellectually and emotionally satisfying for a lot of people who've always felt like they're taking crazy pills. To hear someone say it and to say it in these terms and to put it out there, because so much of it has been downplayed or kind of dismissed as locker room talk or just rhetoric.
Yeah.
And I think that, so to that extent, I think it's in many ways it's already served a useful purpose.
The South African petition in and of itself, doing the work of aggregating specifically all of the statements that have been made by Israeli spokespeople, elected officials, that are pretty explicit about the goal being some combination of ethnic cleansing and genocide, has been a powerful document that's been very useful for people as they go ahead and make their case as to why, whatever you call it, what's going on there is, yeah.
A lot of normies, you say genocide, you do sound insane to them.
Hyperbolic, yeah.
For a lot of people who don't follow this, they think, well, Israel's not going to commit genocide. Why would they do that? Well, they were attacked. And so getting it across to sort of mainstream discourse that the genocide word here is not just being thrown around as some lefty pejorative, but is actually a sort of specific claim with a specific set of facts that many genocide scholars, including many in Israel, have made clear, if not gets to that point, is very much adjacent or kind of proto-genocide in terms of intent.
Right.
I think it's more than cross the line, but you just said that at the very least is useful because, again, I think there is a bit of watering down of these terms, and it can seem like the left is just being hysterical here. But again, this goes back to the problem of analogy to tabloidism. It's being described that way by people because that's what it's meeting the definition of. And getting kind of half paying attention liberals to pay attention to those terms is difficult, I think. And unfortunately, just because that's who wields dispositive power in our politics, you have to do that. Otherwise, what am I doing here? Talking to a microphone, right? And like I think that to that extent, it's been useful because it's showing that this is actually a sort of legal. Some guy shows up in a powdered wig and says that it somehow makes it more official. And again, despite the fact that Palestinians have been saying all this for many months, if not, obviously years in terms of the bigger picture. It's just, this is a case where the quote unquote left in the United States, such that it is on board with 90% of global opinion. Again, 153 countries supported a ceasefire resolution. Every international aid organization, every Western, aid organization, every medical establishment that is not centered either in North America or Europe, pretty much everywhere says, look, Israel needs to stop bombing Gaza. They need to sort this out politically. It's a fundamental political problem. And here it's treated like it's this fringe opinion. Like here's some radical Noam Chomsky in a basement Cheeto blogger guy, and it's just like and then Biden is the sort of centrist, steely-eyed, steady hand. And it's like, no, I don't think people quite realize how fringely right-wing this White House is on this issue.
Yeah.
And
meanwhile,
how out of touch.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
I was just going to say that meanwhile, on September 6th, I just pulled up an article titled U.S. lawmakers visiting The Hague say Putin is committing genocide in Ukraine. So on the other side, there was a lot of a much more liberal use of the word when talking about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It flowed freely from the lips of members of the State Department in a way that, of course, we're not seeing here. To your point about the good guys versus the baddies. Just before we wrap, now we're at an hour, I wanted to briefly ask you about your most recent, I believe, article in The Nation about crybalyism in light of another story that has been undercovered by the mainstream press. The Intercept, as I understand it, still is the only in Columbia University's own reporters who've done a good job as well, but who have covered this alleged attack by two students who were formerly in the IDF against peaceful pro-Palestinian protesters using skunk, which is a kind of chemical weapon that was developed by the IDF that causes not only a terrible smell, as the name suggests, but also skin irritation, eye irritation, and et cetera, that lasts for days. Have you been following this one?
A little bit. I haven't done a real kind of a media analysis of it, but I've read the reporting in Intercept. I think, this is the college campus meltdown stuff is obviously the biggest crock of shit in the world. It is very much about disciplining youthful people who have ideals, which is sort of the worst thing you can have. And of course, it's also a proxy battle on woke and DEI and all these other kind of right-wing hobby horses. It sort of fits into all. That's why you sort of saw this combination of Bill Ackman and Christopher Rufo and all these horrible, sort of vulgar bullies teaming up to kind of play this role of like taking on big college kid as a sort of entity that needs to be disciplined. And so that tracks that there would be a total asymmetry of how that's covered versus a lot of this ginned up campus controversy. I'm doing an analysis to come out later about how many times the New York Times covered the Harvard president Gay's supposed plagiarism, which was at a certain point bordering on self-parody. I mean, we're talking dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, front page articles, in terms of their website, not their newspaper, over the issue in the most kind of ginned up and contrived way versus, say, for example, only one article during our time frame covering children that had died in Gaza, which would seem, again, objectively more important to any morally healthy person. But the campus stuff is a combination of horrible forces. It's sort of everybody in these publications went to elite schools, so it's a lot of fart sniffing. A lot of them have grievances against sort of unrelated grievances against the kind of the woke youth who they hate for unrelated reasons. It's a labor disciplining thing. It's a protest disciplining thing. It's a way to discipline pro-Palestinian protests. It's got it all. I mean, it's got it all. It's
Well,
the
I love this term cry-bullyism. Just for the record, for people who aren't familiar with this concept, I think it's really useful to understand creatures like Ackman in particular, who have this. It's a particular feature of it is a kind of a hypocrisy, obviously, given the accusations against his wife being treated very differently by him than how he treated Claudine Gay. I mean, how would you define cry-bullyism?
well, so he tried to get a dozen people fired. He worked to get university presidents fired. He spiked the football and championed them when they were fired eventually or were forced to quit. Went after obscure college campus activists. And then the second Business Insider pointed out that his wife was in fact also a serial plagiarist, or was a serial plagiarist rather. He made veiled references to like his wife being suicidal, how she was going to be driven to suicide, and how she's an introvert. He became very small beings very fast. And this is part of a broader trend that I note about. We see this with Starbucks will bully its union organizers, fire them, take away their health care. And then when you see them on conference calls talking about support for unions, they use therapy speak about how upset they are. And it's part of a broader cultural trend of people in power, billionaire CEOs, billionaire donors to Harvard, sort of pro-Israel people in Congress are constantly using the language of feeling threatened by what is routine nonviolent protest. And we're talking, sit-ins, things that were common in the civil rights movements, common in the Vietnam War protests of the 1960s and 70s, very common nonviolent protests are increasingly being spun as being menacing or threatening or making them feel, a certain way. It's all kind of very solipsistic. And they're exploiting this kind of liberal therapy speak to hide themselves from accountability and to sort of paint the powerful as the powerless. And it's a fundamental subversion of power, which of course is the goal. And
it's fascinating because their whole thing, right, is that the problem with CRT and DEI is that they have this systemic, powerful, powerless dynamic where everyone has to go in one of two groups, and they are unable to see, in this instance, Jewish people as anything but the powerful because of their anti-Semitism. So that has been their critique the whole time, has been against this kind of liberal sociological understanding of the world and systems of power and oppression. But the second they want to disguise the fact that they are the richest, most powerful people in the world, complaining about their feelings being hurt and their very public wives coming under some public scrutiny, suddenly,
Right.
in your words, I'm a small bean.
Yeah, and it's like, this is the reason why the reason why I suspect this is, and I don't have direct evidence, but this is a PR tactic that you learn in PR shops. This is like a thing you do when you're under attack, is you try to play the victim to solicit sympathy and sort of redirect sympathy. So it's kind of a 101 thing. And so you saw again the labor MPs where there's someone spray painted blood on your hands on their office, and they said this is very similar to the right-wing attacks.
Crystal knocked.
Yeah,
Oh.
and they didn't quite go that far, but it was.
I definitely saw a crystal knocked argument for somebody getting spray paint on their house, but go ahead. I'm sorry, it might not have been
but
this
that's
one.
not, that's not really the same thing. And protests are always going to be slightly menacing. They've always been slightly menacing. That's the inherent nature of protests. That's why people,
It's the politics of fear. That's what Chris Hedges always says, right?
And so like all this kind of preciousness about like I fear for my safety. It's like you just voted to send 2,000-pound bombs to go liquidate entire fucking city blocks in Palestine. Like shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
And like you can't have it both ways. You can't be this steely-eyed realist pro-Israel guy and then mope and whine about how you feel threatened at the same time. Like and the argument I make is that like our elites used to sort of be stone cold psychos. Like you have your Alan Dulles types, right? Who used MK Ultra on his own son, like used to smoke cigars and kind of loom over maps. And it's like, yeah, but at least they weren't like whining to us all the time. And there's a new sort of current of elite sort of manipulation that is about trying to be our friend all the time, which I hate and don't want. And then also like, and it's like, you're the fucking vice president of labor relations at Starbucks. Why are you fucking crying? Why is Howard Schultz crying on a Zoom call? Like, have some dignity. Like, if you're going to, wear a fucking monocle and a top hat and be rich and shut the fuck up. Don't talk to me like we're friends. Like, don't talk to me like I'm your therapist. And it's both an aesthetic critique. It's also just kind of annoying, but also I do think there's something sinister at the heart of those kinds of politics. And around the issue of Israel and Gaza, we've seen it rear its head a lot. It's been a popular
It is so strange to watch the crew that spent literally, well over a decade at this point calling liberals pink-haired snowflakes. Snowflakes are so sensitive, you're so tender. And then turn around and use the exact same kind of analysis to defend themselves. And I do wonder, and this is a longer conversation that we don't have time for today, but there has been a kind of um, crystallizing of the narrative around power and faux populism that has been adopted by the right? So there was this kind of populist desire trickling around in 2016 that found its expression in Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was defeated. Trumpism arose. And because they were in power, they really doubled down on the rhetoric, obviously not the substance, of what it meant. The insiders were bad. The swamp was bad. The establishment was bad. The big, powerful, moneyed interests, we're not going to look too hard at that one, but ostensibly those things are bad. And so now we're in the situation where this language has become the real lingua franca of the internet and spaces that are dominated by folks like the very online Bill Ackman and Elon Musk. And Elon Musk, you see him trading in this kind of language about how the powerful and the deep state and all of these entities want to control you. And we're all supposed to forget that he's the most wealthy person in the entire world.
This is the very essence of right-wing populism. It's much like the cry-bully dynamic. It's about inverting power dynamics, where you have people at Compact Magazine or JD Vance or any of these toads who think that the elites are associate editors at Teen Vogue versus versus the rich.
Right.
And this is a very common thing that you hear because, again, it's been the nature of right-wing populism since Andrew Jackson. I mean, it has its current that goes back where it's like it's also a mode of producerism, which is to say, there's these parasitic poor people, and then maybe there's some rich people and media types. I mean, again, it's a form of populism that can only see power that's right in front of their face. So if you're like popular, if you're like a famous actor, especially if you're a black actor or a black athlete, you're seen as being elite. But Donald Trump is considered the man of the working people, despite the fact that he is probably more or less genuinely a billionaire. That's the very nature of right-wing populism. It's an inverted.
The students on campus are elites. Bill Ackman is not.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's like Ronald Reagan, the liberal elites and Hollywood elites and academic elites, and it's like, are there some elites in academia and Hollywood? Sure, but they're like half of them were on like Jeffrey Epstein's airplane. These are not like fucking undergrads or editors at these underfunded publications making $72,000 a year. I mean, the whole thing is obviously absurd. It's a total inversion of class politics. It's the language of class without class analysis. It's just Tucker Carlson's whole bullshit shtick.
Yeah. Rufo isn't mad at the oppressor-oppressee dynamic. He's mad that it's not inverted in favor of himself. Thank you so much. Adam, I cannot overstate this. I find Citations Needed to be like a lighthouse in the storm when I am feeling overwhelmed by the nature of having to do the job, in particular on the Hill, and deal on a daily basis with all of these narratives coming at light speed at my face and trying to unpack it for the audience and explain what my reactions are to certain news stories in ways that can get across to a largely conservative audience, trying to help them see the subversion that we were just talking about, where I think there's a lot of genuine populists in the audience who get caught up in some of this narrative building around elites and the like that are weaponized by the right. Like, I find the clarity of your podcast and the sheer amount of research and study that clearly goes into every episode to be grounding and enormously helpful. I think you and Nima Shirazi do an amazing benefit for the left community as a whole. I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for coming on the show today. And I want to strongly encourage all of my listeners to go not only listen to, but to subscribe and support Citations Needed. Where else can they find you, and where else should they be subscribing and supporting your work?
Yeah, thank you. But to be clear, that research is done by our research and writer and producer Julianne Tweeten, and it's obviously all polished together by Florence, our producer, and I would say the Substack, the column Substack I write, and then I freelance everywhere, and then Citations Needed. I think that pretty much covers it. I don't think I have any other media wares to shill for. I think that's pretty much it.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. I appreciate it. Thank you to all of the listeners. As always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith, and subscribe on Mondays if you want an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Take care. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.